If you think back to the lesson on object literals, I think we were working in the object.js file. I created a car object with several properties and functions, and you can see that I've created a new file called this-keyword.js. If you're pausing the video to follow along, then you might want to go ahead and create a this-keyword.html. Yeah, that's right. We're going to write some JavaScript in an HTML page for the very first time in this course here in lesson number 18, because I want to show you how this works in different contexts, this keyword. But getting back to the point at hand, if you recall that example that I've pasted in from that object.js file into this keyword.js, you see line number 10. And at the time, I didn't even proffer an explanation as to what the this.make and this.model actually mean in our application. The fact is that this keyword can be a little bit challenging. So even people with a little bit of JavaScript experience from time to time get a little confused about this keyword. And one of the reasons people get confused about it is because it means something different in JavaScript than in most other programming languages. So you actually have to kind of fight your existing knowledge. So if you're coming from another programming language, the best thing you can do is kind of just leave everything you think you know about well, a lot of topics, but in particular about this keyword at the door. And if you are just coming to JavaScript as your first programming language, then you might even have a slight advantage here because you won't have to fight yourself in what you think you know. But simply put, this keyword in JavaScript represents the way a given function is called. The way a function is called will determine what this represents. Okay, so you essentially bind this keyword to a given context, and we'll explain what that means, based on how you call the function. All right, so up to now, we've not really paid much attention to how we call functions. I told you there was really only one way to call a function, using the method invocation operator. So we would do something like this a little bit later on, right? Like a car.printDescription, all right? And I used the method invocation operator, and I didn't even hint to the possibility that there would be another way or multiple ways to actually invoke a function, but that's actually pretty important when you consider what this keyword represents. All right, you're going to learn in this video, at least, that there are other ways to call a method that allow you to set, or rather bind this keyword to something so that you can do something interesting inside of, in this case, your object or your function or whatever the case might be. Now, you may never need to do this, but it's important to understand the basic rules and how this keyword gets bound to a context and gets referenced inside of your object or your function. There's an entire book written about how this functionality works and all the permutations, and it's awesome. It's a little bit over my head at times, so I'm going to give you an absolute beginner's explanation as to how this all works, but it should serve you well as you're getting started, and then you can refine your understanding a little bit later on. But let's start out by commenting out everything. And you know what? There's a really easy way to comment out everything that I haven't talked about yet. Alt, Shift, and A on your keyboard will add a beginning and an ending code comment character operator to whatever you have selected. So that's a nice quick way to do that. Great. All right, so let's start really simply. I'm just going to create a function called first. And this function is going to return the value of this. What is the value of this? Well, here, if you go console.log, first, is it equal to the global object inside of node? So the global object, we'll talk about that a little bit later, I guess. It is kind of the most basic context things that get executed inside of. So when we create something in the global namespace, a global variable, we would create it essentially attached to the global namespace. It's available everywhere in our application. All right. So let's see if when we call first from line number 20, is this, which gets returned, equal to the global object. So let's go this dash keyword, and it is true. All right. So when I call the first method, basically from the global context, because I haven't created it inside of using the module pattern inside an IFE. Remember what we talked about previously? So I'm basically just calling this here out in the global namespace. And what gets returned back is the fact that this is equal to that global namespace. All right. So now let's try something else. Actually, let me just do this. Let me copy this little comment that I have in my notes because it might be helpful to you for reference. All right. So let's start with another code example now. Function second. And the only purpose of this is just to show that there is this little flag called useStrict. There's a strict mode in JavaScript. We're not going to go into it much, but this will change how this keyword is bound. And so if you have useStrict turned on and you try the same thing that we just did here, in fact, let me comment all this out using that Alt-Shift-A technique. And we essentially do the same thing here where we go console.log and then second equals global. Let's see if we get what we think we're going to get from the first time around. False. All right, well, I happen to know that it will equal undefined. And that is a true statement. What gets returned from this when we use useStrict is an undefined value. It gets bound to essentially nothing. All right. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The rules around binding the this keyword change depending on the context. In this case, the context is useStrict. It will fundamentally change how it works. All right. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the next example here. Let my object equal, and I'll create a property called value and set that to my object. And then I'm going to use create a global variable called value. And I'm going to set it on the global object by doing this global.value. At this point, I've created a new property on the global object, and I'm going to call this global object. All right. Again, in Node, this has special significance. If you're doing web development, it's actually window, and we'll look at that here in just a little bit. All right. So now let's go function third, and we'll return this dot value, and then we'll do a console.log third. So by default, what do you think will get printed out? Will we print out the value of the global object, which I set to the string global object, or the value of my object, which is set to my object? Well, hopefully, based on what we learned in this first example, you already know where I'm going with this. And because we called third from the global namespace, when we reference this keyword, it's referencing this global variable. So when we grab the value property, it's grabbing the value property of the global variable, thus printing out global object. Let me show you that there are other ways to actually invoke the third function, and we can control the binding of the this keyword like so. So here we're going to console log, and then I'm going to call third, but I'm not going to use the method invocation operator. I'm going to use the call method or the call function of the third function. All right. So it has a built-in method called call, and there I can pass in my object. And this is how I will bind the this value to my object, so the value will be pulled from my object, not from the global variable. So let's save that. Here, let me actually comment this one out. Save it, and let's run it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. There's another similar function called apply, and they're very similar. And in this context, won't be obvious how they're different because I don't have any additional properties to send in, or rather input variables to the third function. So if I had something like name, I would use then like call dot, Bob. But this can also take an array here in the apply, which could include Bob. So let's just do this. See what we get. I haven't tried this beforehand, so yeah, object Bob. Okay. Now, just out of curiosity, what would happen if we did this? Probably nothing at all. It'd just be blank. Yeah, object undefined. All right, global object with the word undefined next to it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, what I just added on there. That's really to illustrate the difference between call and apply. And so if I had multiple input parameters in the call, I would just add them on there. If I had multiples, I could add them on inside of an array. All right, that's the only difference. Okay, but let me just kind of annotate this and talk through it just for a moment. So just to kind of recap this, the this keyword depends on how a function is called, and an object can be passed as the first argument to call or apply, and the this keyword will be bound to it like we did here in lines number 54 and 55. All right. And so just to kind of remind you about this, I'm going to go ahead and say this property is set on the global object, and then kind of works inside of here. This will return something different depending on how we call this method, right? And then I just want to add this little annotation here as well. Both call and apply allow you to explicitly set what you want to represent this, or how we want to bind this. The difference is how the additional arguments are passed in, like I show you here. Okay. So when it comes to calling a method of an object, the call site will be the object itself, and all of its properties are available to this. In fact, if we take a look back here, that's what happened. That's how I did this and why I use this.make and this.model. Again, when it comes to calling a method of an object, in this case print description, the call site, in this case car.printDescription, will be the object itself, and all of its properties like make, model, and year are available to this inner function only when I use the this keyword, because this represents this context. All right, because I'm calling print description using the car object. All right, so to call the function, I would use the object reference. That object reference car gets bound to the this keyword. So to further illustrate this idea, let's do this. I'm going to actually select everything we've done from here down, and Shift Alt and A. And so let's go function fifth. And here I'm going to go console.log and this dot first name and a space and this dot last name. And hopefully this will make a lot more sense. All right, so now what I want to do is create two objects. So let customer1 equals, and we'll go first name colon Bob, last name colon Tabor, and then I'm going to create a print property that's going to point to the fifth function, like so. All right, and I'm going to copy this and just duplicate it. I'll make this customer 2. Call this Richard Boughton. All right, and then finally we'll go customer2.print, customer1.print. All right, so now look at how this works. What is the context? How do I call the print method that's pointed to fifth? Well, in this first case, I'm using the object, if it'll let me get in there, object customer2. That is the context. We're going to bind the this keyword to customer2 because I'm calling it as a property of customer2. I'm going to bind next in line number 85 the this keyword of the print method to customer1. So let's go ahead and so to me, this example is really interesting because the call site is the object's reference to the function, and the this keyword can be used to reference the various properties of the object that was used to call the function. So it becomes an interesting and elegant way to essentially pass values into a function without defining a bunch of input parameters to the function itself. All right. So now what I want to do is kind of stop working with Node for a little bit and look at the this keyword in the context of a web page. So I've created a new this-keyword.html. I can use the term doc. You can see that when I type in the word doc, it's an Emmet abbreviation. If you're not familiar with Emmet, just search for it online. It's basically a shorthand syntax for, I guess you could say, for snippets for code editors, right? So when I hit enter on the keyboard, it kind of creates this, bam, this whole document outline for me. And it has some replaceable areas like the device width and the initial scale and the content and all that business. I don't want to change any of that stuff. What I do want to do is add a script section here near the bottom for reasons I'll talk about in another video. And then what I want to do is above that, create just a simple button. So here we go, button. And inside the button, I'm going to say, hey, click me. And then I'm going to set a onClick equal, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Here, I'm going to actually create a function that I want to call whenever the button is clicked. So function, and I'll give it a name, click handler, like so. And inside of here, I'm going to go, first of all, I'm going to allow something to be passed in. I'm going to allow a value to be passed in, and then I'm going to print out whatever that is to the console. So console.log arg. All right. Now, we'll come back to this in just a moment. I'm going to leave a space and go console.log this. All right. And then in here, I'm going to say the button on click equals click handler. So I'm going to call the click handler. I'm going to pass in this, the this keyword. All right. So if all goes well here, I should just be able to right click on this and say reveal in Explorer. And then when it's in the Windows Explorer, I can just like hit the enter key on the keyboard to actually open it up in my default browser. And what I want to do is I want to use the F12 tools in Edge. I'll bring up this little window at the bottom here. And I want to look at logs. So make sure that you're on the console tab and select the logs sub-tab. I'm going to click the click me button. And we'll see the results of both of our console.logs. In the first case, what we get back is the this that was passed in as arg and printed out directly to screen. And so in this case, the this keyword will reference this entire element. All right, so let's take a look at that again here. You can see how button on click gives me the whole thing. So I can do something like this, which if you're familiar with web development, should not blow you away, I should be able to do arg.innerText. And if you're familiar with web development at all, you would expect to see what there. Let's refresh the page. Click the Click Me button again. And you see Click Me. All right, that's the inner text of that button. So I'm able to get to all the properties of this button. But the key here is that the this keyword represents this entire button. And I'm passing the this keyword in so that I can look at this entire button, inspect it, grab a property out. But when I use the this keyword inside of my click handler function, what do I get? I get the global object. Now we said in Node, the global object, the name of it is global. In a web browser, the global object's name is window. So I can actually just like use this little arrow, this little caret, chevron right next to object window, and it will allow me to view all of the objects, the child objects of the window. And there are literally maybe, if not hundreds, definitely dozens of different objects and properties that we can inspect and change programmatically. We'll come back to some of those ideas a little bit later. But basically, the takeaway from this is that whenever code is called from an inline on event, like on click, on event handler, this is set to the DOM element on which that listener is defined. That's why we got back this entire button, including the text, including the closing button tag. But we've not taken any special steps to bind this inside of this function we've defined here, the click handler. So it defaults to the global object, the window object. Okay. So the moral of the story is that what this keyword is bound to is not always obvious. It takes a bit of detective work, more so than the this keyword in other programming languages, but it has to do with how a given function is called and the site from which it is called. So in this case, this keyword is used at the call site is at this element level. In this case, this keyword is used at the global level, all right? And that will change the value of this and what it's bound to. But by default, functions that are called using the method invocation operators alone will use the context in which the call is made. So if the call is made in the global context, then this keyword will be bound to the global object. If the call is made in an object, then, like we saw here near the end, this keyword will be bound to that particular object. And we were able to use it to grab out the values of the given object, all right? And you can take control of what this keyword is bound to by calling it using either a call or the apply method of a given function. And we talked about what they do and how they're different. And finally, whenever you use them use this keyword in a browser, once again, what this is bound to depends on how it's being called and who is calling it. All right. So hopefully that clears up what this keyword is. I've given you a lot of examples. I've tried to speak a little bit more slowly, and hopefully you can wrap your mind around what this actually is. And hopefully from this point on, you'll be able to identify what this is in your code. All right. Hopefully that helps. All right. You're doing great. Hang in there. We're getting close to being we're more than halfway done, and you're doing awesome. See you in the next video. Thanks.